There had been a series of robberies in the Santa Monica area, and it was suspected that they were black people coming from outside, you know, and there was this sort of, scary. And so there was, I read this article about a couple, a very nice couple, had left their home, and the neighbors had seen in the middle of the day some black guy breaking in. Called the police, and told the police, you know, that we had these problems with black people coming into our neighborhood. And so the police went in, and the house was empty, but there was one area that was locked, and they heard, or barricaded, they couldn't tell, and they heard sounds inside, so they called her back up, and they went in and broke in with drawn guns, and what did they find? A young boy and a young girl, just dressed in rags, totally filthy, and as it turned out, had never been outside, and were virtual captives of this perfect young couple, middle-aged couple. So it just struck me, the irony of it just struck me, and this was during the time of Bush Sr., and there was a great feeling in the country, I thought, of you know, the rich are getting much, much richer, and the poor are getting much, much poorer.
Now, there's a lot more comedy in this than I remembered from seeing it whenever it came out.
It's goofy.
It's really goofy, and Everett McGill seems to forget sometimes that he's not still in Quest for Fire. But you know, you've told me before that you were really known for your humor before you started making horror films. And was this an attempt to meld the two?
Yeah, I always had this sort of yin and yang going, you know, pulling at each other, and I think I sort of got myself over it, but there was a period where if I was doing things that were really gory or horrible, I would also throw in a lot of comedy. I think in some cases it almost went over the top of this one, and in a way it sort of became a sort of a wild black comedy.
Well, there's a lot of Roadrunner in this too.
Very much. I mean, you know, the dogs being played in comedy and everything else. I don't know. You know, sometimes I think it went too far, and sometimes I think, well, it was a nature of the picture to have this bizarre comedy to it. I mean, I've always been interested in kind of the mixture of comedy and horror. I think they're very similar. I've often said that, you know, the building up the tension with an explosive release and talking about the forbidden is very similar to comedy and to horror. So I think horror is kind of a big dark joke, and I think comedy is, in a way, disguised horror. I mean, it happened very fast. Sean Cunningham and I made Last House on the Left, and it was kind of like there was a group of guys who wanted a scary movie for the theater chain, so we made Last House on the Left, and it scared the pants off of a lot of people. But it also immediately changed totally all of my relationships. Everybody looked at me like totally different. You know, like wouldn't leave their children alone in the room with me, things like that. You know, Sean and I was the writer of that duo, and he was the producer. I wrote at least half a dozen films in a 2-year period after Last House came out that were comedies and social dramas and all sorts of things, anything but horror, and nobody was willing to put up money for them. And everybody said, if you want to make another scary movie, we'll give you money for that. So after 2 years, I was broke, and you know, had child support payments to make, and so I took a friend of mine said, "Come out to the desert." This is Peter Rock, who was producer of The Hills of Lies. We'll make a scary movie in the desert, and I was literally just looking. Okay, so you able to get in and kind of work. So did that, and then that got critical reviews, and I started this sort of long process of, well, movies have to be scary, but that doesn't mean you can't comment about a lot of very interesting things. So I just started to not feel bad about it, started to feel like intrigued about it.
Well, Hills Have Eyes brings up an interesting question too about sequels and remakes. You've been lucky enough to be involved in most of the remakes of your work so far. Is there going to be a remake of People Under the Stairs?
Well, we've talked about it. I mean, you know, the remakes sort of came about for two reasons. One was the first two films that I made with close friends. One, this guy Peter Rock, who lives like a block from here, and one with Sean Cunningham, Last House with Sean and The Hills of Lies. We just did it on a handshake. I mean, you know, and it was 50-50. And those contracts, for whatever reason, were 30-year contracts. So in other words, we sold the rights to the property to whoever came up with the money for 30 years. And I can remember back in those days, we were living in New York, we were all taking drugs and living very dangerous lives. None of us thought we would live for 30 years more. Well, we'll be dead, who cares? And then by God, we're still alive, 30 years later, and we sort of looked at each other in two separate cases, like, I think Peter called me up and said, you know what, I think it's been 30 years. I think we own it again. Get out of here. No, I think we do. Went back to the contract, and sure enough. So we did a remake of Hills of Ice, and we did a remake of The Last House. Now, the Nightmare on Elm Street is a totally different story. That script had a great deal of difficulty finding an actor, and by the time that Bob Shea found the money for it, I was so broke. I was borrowing money actually from Sean Cunningham to pay my taxes, and after that I had nothing. I had lost the house. Everything was like one of those. I really believed in the film and I really stuck with it, but by the time Bob found the money, it was like, I'll pay you X amount of dollars. And it's funny because I've just been going through all my favorites. Between films, I get into this organizational fury because normally everything just goes out the window when you're directing and your house is a mess. So I ran across the contract for Nightmare on Elm Street, and basically just, in all universes for all time, and all permutations of humanity, we own your script. And I just thought I was the most fortunate guy in the world to get that made. So I never thought about it, and never thought there would be a sequel, let alone a whole gigantic franchise. So that film's being made by total strangers. I have no idea what they're doing. Nobody's called me. There's no reason really why they would call me.
So it's just going to be based on characters created by Wes Craven?
Well, I think it's a remake. I think it's I think Nightmare will be based on characters, but that's the only thing they have to do with it. So it's an odd feeling. That's the way that's showbiz. Yeah, and I just watched Scream this afternoon because there's some talks of possibly being on Scream 4, but that's Randy giving the rules of horror films. One of the fun things about that script is it sets everything on its head. So, the person that does have sex is Neve Campbell having sex for the first time and she survives, and the guy who backs into the kitchen saying, "I'll see you later," and Randy says that he'll be dead in the kitchen with a knife, is actually one of the killers. So, there are things that are cliches that are in horror films that turn out to be not true, and in some cases, I think what I've always felt with things like sex and denial, all these things are things that can be devices we use to not look at a painful reality. Now, we don't have painful realities looking at this every second of the day, but when there is a painful reality, and she said to have sex, or to get drunk, or do drugs, or whatever it is, and you don't face the reality will come and get you. So I think that's more what they're about, is really about staying alert. It's the Nightmare on Elm Street of whatever you do, don't fall asleep. And it's not so much about having premarital sex or anything like that, so much as paying attention if there's something dangerous around you.